Hey there, welcome to the Thriving in Wellness podcast with Haley and Caitlin. This podcast is for women who are tired of just surviving and ready to truly thrive. It's time to reclaim your health and build trust in your body.
Join us as we mythbust nutrition topics, tackle your mindset, and dive into the nerdy side of women's health. Just a reminder that this is meant for educational purposes only and is not meant to be used for medical diagnosis or treatment. Now let's jump in.
Welcome back and happy Thursday. Today we are talking about tracking your intake. And this is kind of a contrast to what we talked about before. So last week on our call, we had a guest and we talked about how using tracking apps or wearables can actually be detrimental to our health. But we're actually going to talk about the flip side and see when it can be beneficial, because we like to live in the gray area and we recognize that during different seasons of life and for different people, different approaches are needed. So let's start off by talking a little bit more about what we see in practice when these tools are actually beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. So we will use these, tracking your intake to help patients actually become more in tune with your body. So just like Haley was saying, like last week we talked all about how, it can help you, like it kind of causes you to get out of tune with your body. So it can actually help you get in tune with your body. And there's a whole camp of dietitians that are very against tracking your intake. And it tends to be when it's like very focused on tracking calories, because it can lead to disordered eating patterns. And Haley and I are both very aware of that and mindful of that when we're recommending any sort of tracking of intake with any of our patients. And I feel like even when we're talking about things on social media or more of this like public setting, we try to be mindful of what we're saying and making sure that, we're not saying things too extreme.
Yeah, I honestly think it's ridiculous when there's providers, dietitians saying that any sort of tracking, any sort of macro tracking or paying attention to your food is disordered eating. Because I think it's not true. For a lot of
Right.
people, they have no idea how much they're
Mhm.
eating, or they have no connection to their hunger cues and they're under eating unintentionally. And so these are times when bringing in a tracking tool to be a part of the learning process can be huge and really beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say both of us probably use it the most for people who we suspect are under eating. And it can help like objectively show them like, oh, I thought that I was like way
Yeah.
overeating, that I needed to just eat less, but here I am eating 800 calories a day.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite reactions is when I calculate out my recommendations, the calories and macros and everything, and they are shocked by that, or they start logging it and they're like, that is so much food. It's like, yes, because your body actually needs that fuel. And they've been dieting and under eating for so long that it feels like a massive amount of food.
Especially when you're eating like healthy, nutritious foods, then, you know, a lot of those foods are bulky and lower in calories
Mhm.
compared to, like if you're eating fast food, then it's going to be a lot easier to, go overboard on your
Skyrockets.
calories when you're eating a small amount. But when you're eating healthy foods, it is a lot of food to get up to where we typically recommend for people.
Yeah, so we like to use this as a tool for people to have that like data point, because some people just need to see the numbers and be like, oh, you're right, I am actually under eating, or you're right, I'm not getting enough protein. And I also think it could be helpful. We've talked about radical honesty on a previous episode, but when you're in this place where you're frustrated that your body doesn't seem to be doing what it should be doing with the changes that you're making, like if you're not losing weight, the tracking apps and these tools can be helpful to be able to be brutally honest with yourself. Because sometimes you're like, oh yeah, I'm doing fine. Like I'm eating really well. I'm staying within my range. But then you track it and you might for a few days, but like it's not as consistent as you thought it was. And so there's no ignoring that anymore.
Yeah, the consistency piece is huge. So I have some people who love tracking every single day, and they'll notice like, oh, it was like almost every day that I was going and eating, a bunch of ice cream, or I didn't realize how often I was having 2 or 3 glasses of wine when I thought that I really just had one every once in a while. But
Mm-hmm.
I also have some people who I only have track like 3 days in a row so that
Yeah.
they don't get burnt out with tracking every day. And they'll even notice I'm really good on the days that I track, and then I'm not as good on the other days. And I'm usually having them track 3 days in a 2 week period. And they're noticing that there's a shift in how they're eating on those 3 days.
Yeah.
And so that's a really good way for us to recognize, okay, the things that you're tracking and that we're looking at together, if it's like things are looking great, this is how we want things to be, but you're only doing that 3 out of 14 days, then like no wonder things aren't going the way that you want them to go.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point too. Oftentimes I like neither of us want to be having people log every day for the rest of your lives. Like I don't
For
want you to
sure.
be an 80-year-old woman where you're like weighing your food or anything like that. So like when it comes to specifically tracking calories and macros, I usually have people do it for just a few days to get an understanding of where they're at and
Mhm.
to give me some good information too, right? Because we could go over like a typical day, but memory is really crappy. Like that's not a reliable thing to be able to go back and remember. Like I barely remember what I ate for dinner last night, right? So to think back like a week before and remember what you've eaten. I want to talk more about that, but real quick, when I say tracking too, like there's so many different routes that we could go. Yes, we could use the
Mm.
tracking apps where we're seeing not only the calories, but the macronutrients and our micronutrients too. Like this is a good way to get like, are we getting enough potassium? How is our magnesium and sodium looking? Like understanding those minerals. However, tracking could look different for everyone. If it's truly just that we need that accountability to bring up that mindfulness, because a lot of people actually do need that, like because they know they're going to log it. And this is usually just in the beginning to build those habits, build their routine. Tracking their food can be really helpful for them. And so that could be just like jotting it down or even just
Mhm.
taking pictures of their meals. It doesn't have to be calorie obsessive or even looking at the number specifically.
Right. I have lots of people that get overwhelmed when they go to log things of like, I couldn't find the exact brand that I got, or
Mhm.
like I made a soup that was homemade and it has all of these ingredients in it. And like, how do I know how much chicken and all these different vegetables are in my soup? And I'm like, we don't have to get that nitty gritty. Um, and so yeah, you can take it off of the app completely and just make those notes or take the pictures. Or I will even have people sometimes like in a notes, like within the app, and just
Mhm.
put in a note, homemade chicken noodle soup. And
Yeah.
then we can talk about that. And I can kind of ballpark in my head how many calories a serving of homemade chicken noodle soup is. So, like you don't have to worry about that. Um, but like calories and tracking and all of that is not like there isn't the perfect numbers like we want it to be. We're still ballparking things,
Mhm.
so it doesn't have to be as exact as I think some people feel like it needs to be.
Yeah, and even the apps and even the nutrition labels are not
Yeah,
100% accurate. Funny
right.
story, I was talking to my friend who recently started tracking because she wanted to make sure she was getting enough protein. And I was just talking to her about it the other day, and she started to eat healthier. She's like, but now that I'm eating more homemade and healthier foods, it's harder for me to track because
Hmm.
so many of those apps have like the barcode. So it's super easy to just like log in processed foods. And I'm like, well, that's ironic. Um, but yeah, I just thought that was funny.
Yeah, that is funny but I mean, then the goal is because we don't want people to track forever.
Yeah,
The goal
exactly.
is that they start eating less processed foods, feel frustrated by needing to track all the time, and then they just give up tracking and hopefully
Yeah.
have created some healthier habits.
And usually when you're making that transition, it's easier for you to not overeat, right?
Hmm.
So if that's the challenge for you, is just going way overboard on calories. Like when you're eating more at home, like you said earlier, like you have bigger volume, you're usually having more balance, you're having fresher foods. That's going to help you feel more satisfied. Nutrient dense foods. Whereas, like, if you're eating out those processed foods, it's really easy for those calories to add up because it's all that processed food. And even though it doesn't feel like as much food, like I don't go out to fast food much, but when we travel, like I'll look up the menu. I'm
Hmm.
shocked by the calories. Like just in like a simple taco, or like I think I wanted to order a bean and cheese burrito. And I was just like, oh my goodness. Like obviously it's not something like if I want the bean burrito once in a while thing, like I'll have it and that's fine. I'm not gonna freak out about it. But it's still like shocking to me to see because I kind of live in a bubble sometimes where I'm eating at home so often I forget like that's the diet for so many people.
Hmm. Yeah, and then if you made a bean burrito at home, like the calorie difference, it really is shocking. I'm like, I don't even know how you get so many calories.
What are they putting in it?
Right, because sometimes I work with people who are trying to gain weight, so I'm trying to increase their
Yeah.
calories. And I'm like, I don't, you want to do it in a healthy way, so I don't want to tell you to go out and get fast food, but
They got
that's
some
an
trick
easy
up their
way
sleeve.
to, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I feel like we're getting a little bit off track here. But I want to talk about another aspect of tracking that can be really helpful for people when, again, trying to learn how much they need, but also what. So understanding like what meals help them feel their best, whether it be just feeling fuller longer, feeling energized, or maybe we are trying to identify some food sensitivities or triggers for like GI issues, things like that.
Yeah. So this is a great time to track your food, and it might be easier if you're more looking at how your body is reacting to foods and you're not needing the the macros and stuff as much. It might be better to just jot it down.
Mhm.
But sometimes people are even finding, when they're eating more protein, they feel more energized and they feel better. So even still using an app, it really kind of depends on what's going to work best for you and allow you to be more consistent because when we're looking at those sorts of things and really getting into like food sensitivities, we do need more consistent tracking because food sensitivities are not always going to be like, well, I ate this today and then within a couple of hours had this reaction. Sometimes there's a bigger delay and we need to be able to look back at things a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think along the lines of the food sensitivity piece or just triggers for you, it might not be like something you have to avoid forever, but right now while you're working on healing your gut, you need to limit it, right? I think it's really helpful to put in your symptoms and how you're feeling after the meal. This is something that was really key for one of my clients who has some complex gut issues. She We were doing like all the things. We had done a GI map addressing a lot of these infections. But I finally had her get a little bit more consistent with logging her food and putting in her symptoms. And then we realized like she can have gluten. She hasn't been officially diagnosed, but we suspect celiac disease. So she can't have gluten. And so she was eating all these gluten-free products. And so often they're using corn.
Mhm.
And there was a couple of days where she noted that she had a really bad bloat. Her stomach was really painful after eating corn-based products. And she was thinking, like, she didn't see that connection.
Yeah.
But I just said, like, hey, have you ever noticed like corn doesn't settle well? And so she's like, oh, I've never noticed that connection before. And
Mhm.
she cut it out, and we're still working on things, but like significant symptom improvement just from that.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, it sucks that you have to cut out another food, right? Hopefully she'll be able to tolerate it down the line,
Right.
but still, like even having another set of eyes on that can be really helpful too.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I look at it as like that's amazing coming from the standpoint of like the flip side is feeling like I don't know what I can eat and I'm terrified to eat because it might trigger, some sort of reaction in my body. And it's so incredibly empowering to know like these are the things that I can't eat. And if I
Mhm.
don't eat those foods, for the most part, I'm going to feel pretty good.
Yeah, and I don't want to say there's always a connection. There's always like a food that's setting it off, because another example, I just did a GI map review with someone who she's like, I have tracked and tried to figure out what the connection is between when I'm having this horrendous heartburn and when I'm feeling okay. And she's like, I've tried all these different foods and I can't figure out what the trigger is. And for her, I honestly don't think it was a trigger. Like, I don't
Mm,
think it was a food thing. Sure, her H. pylori was really high. So I'm suspecting that's the main issue there. But
yeah.
I think to be able to rule that out to help you feel more confident with your food choices, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Tying back in like the energy and just like how you feel piece and like not necessarily related to like food sensitivities or anything like that. When I was in high school, and like truly I was just like meant to be a dietitian. It was like literally in my bones as a kid. But I was like, hmm, I wonder how different breakfasts are gonna make me feel throughout the day. Let's do a little experiment on myself. And like, I think this was like my freshman or sophomore year. Like
Oh,
it was
wow.
early high school.
Yeah.
Um, and so most of my breakfast, it was either cereal, oatmeal, or eggs. That's just kind of like what we ate and what I rotated. And so one day I had cereal and I noticed how I felt, and then oatmeal, and then
Mhm.
eggs. And I found that on days that I had cereal, I was like starving in first period and like reaching for my snacks. And I was so hungry throughout the rest of the day. But on the days that I had eggs, I could make it all the way until our nutrition break. So it was like first period, second period, and then we
Mhm.
had a little break. And I didn't have to eat before then. And so pretty much since then, I like 95% of the time have eggs for
Eggs.
breakfast.
Eggs are my go-to. If I
Yep.
developed a sensitivity to that, I would be heartbroken.
Oh, me too. Yeah, I don't know what we would do. We could not have eggs in this household. But it was like then I was like, okay, I feel the best when I have eggs for breakfast. And so then it, only motivates me and I have more desire to eat eggs for
Yeah.
breakfast every day, knowing that I'm going to feel good.
Yeah. My husband can't eat eggs, so that breakfast is hard now.
Yeah. I mean, we'll
Yeah.
have eggs for dinner a lot too.
Yeah. Getting enough protein in the morning can be challenging. I was going to say something else, and now I'm totally blanking on what really stood out to me with that. Oh, you know what I was thinking about is growing up. I wasn't at this point because I was like experimenting like you were, but I remember when I was younger, like my breakfast used to be cereal and toast. So just thinking, like knowing what I know now is like I was given all the carbs. Like
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if I could, I don't know, look at old Haley, little Haley, how her energy and her hunger levels were. She had just had some eggs with that cereal or eggs with the toast instead.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. So I just want you to think about is tracking your intake something that might be helpful for you, whether it's to assess if you're under eating and you need to eat a little bit more. This is great if you don't have a lot of hunger cues.
Hmm.
Can help you kind of increase your intake and bring back those hunger cues a little bit. Or maybe you're just wanting to, optimize your health, improve some of your symptoms, and seeing if it's related to the foods you eat, either, like the combinations and how much you're eating of things, or any specific foods or sensitivities.
I think the biggest thing to remember, because I know this is so different from like the complete opposite of what we talked about last week, is to remember this is not black or white, right? There's always going to be changes in some seasons where certain things are helpful, other seasons where it might be detrimental. And so again, with this theme of learning to trust your body, it's key for you to pay attention to some of those red flags. But say if you're tracking and you're not noticing those red flags and you're finding it beneficial, that's totally okay too. So give yourself permission. You don't have to completely disconnect from this and say, I can never use these again. And maybe you just go through these phases where you use it and then take a break to be able to keep that balance and healthy relationship.
Yeah, and the purpose of tracking is not to like check off a box of like, I'm healthy, I tracked my intake today.
Yes.
It's to learn and understand and know your body better so that you can make changes and improvements to what you're eating so that you can then feel better.
Exactly. So we'll leave that there and we will see you next week on Monday. But as always, feel free to reach out with us with any topics that you're interested, any big takeaways from this on Instagram at dietitian Haley and dietitian Caitlin, and we will have that linked in the show notes.